Hello guys and welcome back to the channel. It is time for yet another underwater video on the canal. Now the last ones I did were for the pike in the winter time, and now the weather's a lot nicer, we're going to be targeting the tench. That's what I'm hoping to do today. Only one time in the past have I captured a tench actually picking up the hook bait, getting hooked in front of the camera and then being landed, and I'm hoping to do that exact same thing again. I picked a beautiful countryside swim. There's literally nobody around. It's currently 5 AM on a Sunday. Oh my god, who gets up at that time on a Sunday? And I've just put the camera down there now. I put a bit of feed in there. We're fishing ground bait, worms, sweet corn, all the classic tench baits. And down there right now we've possibly got a few fish feeding already. One of the things I noticed quite quickly is that the tench are really picky eaters. They don't come in and start mopping up everything like bream and carp do. They tend to go along the bottom quite slowly and just pick up little individual particles of bait one by one, as opposed to getting loads and loads and loads at the same time. And it was apparent after watching some of this footage back that I'd actually been done by a tench a couple of times where they'd come down really close to the bait or even touched the bait and not quite got it in there or got hooked, which was really disappointing to see on the underwater camera. Now because I'd not managed to take on the sweet corn or the bread dish yet, I decided to go for the most classic tench bait in the book, and that is a good old juicy worm. There's no tench out there that can resist a worm. With the tench being so confidently feeding on the ground bait, pellets and sweet corn, having the worm in the swim actually was more like an alien bait to these fish. You can actually see them working their way around it, almost avoiding it. I don't know if that's because it was a worm and it was different to what they were used to feeding on at that moment in time, or if it's because they could see the line in the rig or the hook. I'm not sure. But either way, they were avoiding it like the plague. And with the rudd being such a pest and ripping it up, I decided to put on a larger juicy old worm to see if that would make a difference. Fish on. Fish on. Oh. With that first take, my confidence boost was through the roof. I'd hooked into a large fish that I believed was a tench, and unfortunately it got broken off. I wasn't quite sure how, as my rig was pretty tight and I was fishing relatively heavy at this point. Obviously they must have liked the larger worm, so I got another big chunky worm and put it straight back out into the swim. Now with this bit of footage, I couldn't actually see what was going on beneath the surface. So when that worm shot up away from that pike's face as it was about to take it, I was actually just adjusting the rig because the float was caught up on a reed. What perfect timing was that? Bang! Yet another take from a big fish. Only this time, I saw the culprit. It was not a tench, it was in fact, as you guys have been able to see, a lovely pike, which did in fact manage to break me off just before it entered the net. Now it was time to rethink and try again. So I decided actually I was going to reposition the camera and I was going to fish a ledgering tactic, fish about a 3 or 4 inch hook length, and also fish worm on the hook. Now we had some issues with the pike, but I figured maybe if I can get that bait to the bottom really quick, because obviously before on the float it was sinking down really slowly, and that's when the pike were taking it. I decided to fish ledger tactics, get the lead straight down to the bottom quick. Hopefully I could avoid the rud, avoid the pike, and maybe have a bait sat down there long enough for a tench to take. And it was immediately a mistake. It actually begs the question, does this happen more often than we think? When we think we've hooked, let's say a tench, and we think it's broken us off, and in fact it was a decent sized pike. But it was really great to capture that on the underwater camera, and it's something I don't think I've seen on the internet. I've not seen it on YouTube, that must be a YouTube first. And with that in mind, I decided worms was definitely not a go-to bait just now. And seeing as I wasn't going to be using worms anymore, I decided to get the entire tub and throw it straight into the swim to see how the pike would react to that. Now this footage actually makes me believe that pike regularly scavenge on worms and small invertebrates, because the way these pike are attacking these worms is completely different to the way they treat baitfish. When they go to eat a baitfish, they will open their mouth as wide as possible, suck in as much water as possible to be able to get that baitfish to go in. Whereas when they're feeding on these worms, they're going down and delicately almost picking them up with just the front of the mouth before eating them, which is a completely different way of feeding. And look at this bit of bonus footage. While that pike's in the swim, munching on the worms, a tench comes in and actually feeds underneath the pike and takes a piece of sweet corn directly below it. These tench really aren't fearful of the pike. They know their size. They know this pike isn't a threat. And while we're on the subject of pike, I did capture a really cool shot of a small pike doing what it does best. How incredible is that shot? The bait fish are feeding, and their speed that small pike moves. Watch how it affects everything around it. There's even a judder of the camera as that pike flies in and creates that disturbance under the water. And I think it's really cool the way the silt comes up behind that fish after it's stopped. God knows how fast that thing was moving, but in slow motion it does look really cool. Keep going back and replaying that clip. I replayed it like 10-15 times when I first watched it. I thought it was so wicked. Obviously, he's not got the experience yet, come flying in with his mouth wide open and missed everything in the shot. So I decided I was going to move back over onto the float. Single piece of sweet corn, straight onto a size 12 hook, and it was time to get one of these tench. I was absolutely gutted to review the underwater footage. I'd had a classic live float bite, I'd seen it slowly lift out the water. I struck, but I had absolutely nothing, so I assumed it must have been a small rud taking the bait. But after watching the footage back, I watched that tench suck in the bait, have it in there for maybe a second. I struck and you can actually see my piece of sweet corn come out from the tench's mouth and flying out of the water. Now it wasn't on a hair, it was put straight onto the hook. I thought I'd had enough hook point exposed. Obviously this shows not. If I'd have been fishing it on a hair, I'm almost certain I would have got that fish. At this point I'd reviewed all the footage over the last couple of sessions, and it was time to reevaluate, rethink my rig and how I was going to be able to come out here and catch these fish and actually capture a take legitimately underwater and get these fish on the bank. So taking everything into consideration, I decided obviously worms wasn't really the best option to use. I'd also decided that putting in too much bait actually hindered the swim. It seemed as though the tench were very picky feeders. They'd come in and pick up 1 or 2 pieces of food at a time, so I decided to limit the amount of feed I was putting in, meaning that my hook bait would be one of the only pieces they'd be able to pick up. And the biggest change was adapting the rig. So I knew I needed to have all the line pinned down to the bottom, but I also didn't want to make too much of a disturbance. So what I decided to opt for was a hair rig with a size 12 hook and using really light fluorocarbon that would be almost invisible on the bottom, just 3.3 pound fluorocarbon. And then I was using small blobs of tungsten putty, 3 or 4 dotted up from the hook all the way up the line for about 2 to 3 foot. That way my entire line would be pinned down to the bottom. But I'd also be completely freelining the bait, just sat watching that line in the margin and putting all these things into practice. It was time for the very last session and the very last chance at capturing one of these fish, getting hooked underwater and getting it on the bank. I've been trying so hard to get a tench take on the camera and hook it, and I finally managed it. Good size tench, probably a 4.5 pound, and the line got caught on my underwater camera, so obviously as I'm playing it my line couldn't really pull out very well and the tench just snapped me off. It's also moved my underwater camera. Fingers crossed I can get it back. It's really annoying. That was a good fish. It was a good fish. Looking down into the swim, I could see just out towards the opposite bank there was a couple of tench out there, so there's still fish in the area, and of course the rudd was still feeding like mad in the swim, so I knew it wouldn't be too long before we got these fish back in the swim. Now one of the things I was doing with my ground bait was I was actually packing it quite loosely into loose balls, so when it hit the water it almost broke up on impact, creating a large cloud under the water, which would in turn draw in the larger fish like the tench and bream. It seems to be when there's a cloud of bait in the water, they feel a little bit more confident, but also it grabs their attention really well. And this definitely isn't as big as the one I've just lost, but it's still an absolutely wonderful constellation prize. Really chunky little female fish. The big camera actually had a bit of an error during the fight, so I don't know how much you managed to capture. It really was a hard scrap on that 3 pound line anyway. Absolutely brilliant. We cracked the code, we've done it. I'm so happy. Finally, we'd got our prize. The tench we'd been after, hooked underwater, landed safely. It was actually a lot smaller than the one we'd lost earlier. Comparing the underwater footage to the actual size of the fish on the bank, I could see the fish that I actually lost just before it was probably a fish of around 5 pound. The one that I caught was nowhere near that, but it was a very lovely fish, and I was more than happy. And this was actually going to be where I was going to end my session. I wanted to end it with the fish being hooked under the water, landed, and that's where we're ending it today. But before I go, let's recap what we've witnessed today and what we've learned today. So we've learned that tench can be a frustrating species of fish. When you're getting all those fizzing bubbles coming up in your swim, that's them fish actually picking up 1 or 2 pieces of bait at a time and just wafting the fins along the bottom and creating a big disturbance and sending those bubbles up. So when you're sat there waiting for that float to go, actually maybe it's a good idea to put in less feed. We've also learned that perhaps using more of a stealthy tactic with the rig, having the line laid along the bottom, not having too much on show, seems to have worked quite well. Making sure the hook point is well exposed so we don't end up losing the fish or missing the bites, works very well. So if you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a like. Maybe think about subscribing if you want to. This video has taken about 4 full sessions fishing and filming underwater to be able to create. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I hope you appreciate the work that I put into some of these videos, because it can be real hard work. Getting up at 4, 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning, that's criminal, isn't it? Thank you guys for watching, hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you later.